The night my husband told me I could be replaced if I didn't change, I nodded and said nothing. What he didn't know was that this was the moment I stopped trying to save our marriage and started learning how to leave it without losing myself. The first thing I felt was shame, sharp and immediate, because he didn't even lower his voice when he said it in the parking lot behind the grocery store, between the cart return and his car, like my body was just another inconvenience on his list. He said if I didn't lose weight, he would start looking at other options, and the way he said options made my stomach drop harder than the words themselves, because he sounded calm, almost reasonable, like he was discussing phone plans or insurance, not our marriage. We were standing under a flickering light. It was late. The asphalt was still warm from the day, and I remember thinking how strange it was that people were walking past us with bags of food, laughing, getting into their cars, while my life quietly cracked open right there. I didn't cry. Not then. I just nodded, because I didn't know what else to do with my hands or my face, and nodding felt safer than saying anything that might confirm what I was already starting to understand. We drove home in silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you feel dizzy, and I stared out the window, watching storefronts blur together, thinking about how long it had been since he last touched me without hesitation. That night, lying next to him in bed, I realized the threat wasn't really about weight. It was about how replaceable he thought I was, how easily he could imagine a version of his life without me, upgraded, improved, thinner, newer. My name is Emma, and I had been married to Mark for 9 years when he said that. We met in a small coffee shop near the river, back when I was 23, and he was charming in a quiet way. The kind of man who listened more than he talked, who made you feel chosen just by paying attention. Back then, my body was something I never thought about much. It just existed, moved me through the world, fit into clothes without effort, earned compliments I didn't ask for. Life happened slowly after that, like it always does, work stress, long hours. A miscarriage no one knew about except us. Dinners eaten late at night, skipped workouts that turned into months. Comfort food that felt like the only soft thing left in our days. I gained weight gradually, nothing dramatic at first, then more, then enough that I started noticing how mirrors caught me off guard, how photos made me flinch, how Mark's eyes lingered less and less. He never said anything directly for a long time, just small comments, jokes about carbs, suggestions about joining a gym together. That never actually happened. Silence when I dressed up, distraction when I tried to initiate intimacy. The night in the parking lot wasn't the first time I felt rejected. It was just the first time he said it out loud, stripped of politeness. After that, something shifted inside me. Not into motivation like people like to imagine, but into a quiet, hollow alertness, like I was suddenly watching my own marriage from outside my body. I started noticing things I had ignored before. How his phone was always face down. How he smiled at messages and tilted the screen away from me. How he suddenly cared about his clothes again, new shirts, better shoes, cologne he hadn't worn in years. When I asked him once casually who he was texting, he said work, too quickly, and then added a joke about how paranoid I was becoming, which made me feel small and embarrassed for even asking. I tried to lose weight, I really did, because part of me still believed if I could just fix myself, I could fix us. I counted calories, forced myself onto the treadmill after work, ignored the ache in my knees, the exhaustion in my bones. But every effort felt contaminated by fear, like I wasn't doing it for me. I was auditioning for my own husband, competing with women I couldn't see. One evening, while folding laundry, I found a receipt in his jeans pocket, a bar receipt from across town, dated on a night he told me he was working late. My hands shook as I held it, because it was proof, small and flimsy, but real. When I asked him about it, he didn't deny it. He just sighed, like I was tiring him, and said he needed space, that things had been hard for him too, that he felt pressured, trapped, like he couldn't be honest with me anymore. I asked him if there was someone else, and he looked at me for a long moment before saying not exactly, which somehow hurt more than a yes. That was when I understood he was already halfway gone, testing the waters, seeing what else was out there. while I was still trying to save something he had already decided was optional. After that realization, I started remembering moments I had brushed off before, things that suddenly rearranged themselves into something uglier. The way he would linger too long when a waitress leaned over the table. The way he started mentioning women from work by name, casually, like they were background noise, even though he never used to talk about coworkers at all. I remembered how he once compared me to a woman we knew, not directly, just a comment about how she really took care of herself, followed by silence that felt intentional. I also noticed how careful he became with his words around other people, how he still played the role of the devoted husband in public, his hand on my back, his smile convincing, while at home, he treated me like a problem he hadn't solved yet. That contrast did something to my mind. It made me question my own perception, made me wonder if I was overreacting, imagining things, being sensitive because I felt insecure in my own skin. Some nights I lay awake, replaying conversations, analyzing tone and pauses, wondering when exactly love had turned into evaluation. I felt like I was constantly being assessed, not as a partner, but as a product nearing expiration. And the worst part was how quietly it happened, how there was no single dramatic betrayal to point at, just a slow erosion that made me doubt myself more than him. We started living like roommates after that, polite, distant, sharing logistics but nothing else. I slept on the edge of the bed, listening to him breathe, wondering when I became someone he could threaten without fear of losing. The final break didn't come with screaming or slammed doors. It came on a Sunday afternoon in our kitchen, sunlight spilling across the counter, while he stood there and said he thought we should separate for a while, figure ourselves out. He didn't look sad, just resolved. I felt strangely calm as I told him no, that I wasn't interested in a trial separation, that if he wanted out, he could just say it. He looked surprised, like he expected me to beg, to negotiate, to promise change. Instead, I told him I deserved to be with someone who didn't see me as a temporary version of something better, someone who didn't measure my worth against hypothetical alternatives. We signed the papers 3 months later. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of the city, above a bakery that smelled like bread every morning, and for the first time in years I cried without trying to hide it. The first year after the divorce was messy and quiet and lonely in ways I hadn't anticipated. I ate when I wanted, slept when I could, stopped weighing myself entirely. Therapy helped, slowly, peeling back layers of shame I had mistaken for discipline. Somewhere along the way, something unexpected happened. I started taking care of myself without an audience. Not to be thinner for someone else, not to be chosen, not to compete, just to feel strong again, to recognize my own reflection without flinching. The weight came off gradually, differently this time, without panic attached to every pound. I cut my hair, changed my clothes, learned how to exist in my body without apologizing for it. 2 years passed like that. I hadn't seen Mark once. Then one evening after work, I walked into a small art gallery downtown, invited by a coworker, and as I reached for a glass of wine, I heard my name spoken softly behind me, hesitant, almost unsure. I turned around, and there he was. For a second I didn't recognize him, not because he had changed so much, but because the version of him standing there didn't belong to the memories I had sealed away. His shoulders were slightly slumped, his smile uncertain, his eyes searching my face like he was trying to solve a problem he hadn't prepared for. He said my name again, slower this time, as if tasting it. And I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that only comes when something you feared no longer has power. I said hello, my voice steady, surprising even myself. He looked me up and down, not rudely, but openly. And I saw the realization land in his expression before he could hide it. His eyebrows lifted just a fraction, his mouth parted, then closed again. He told me I looked incredible, that he almost didn't recognize me. I thanked him, because politeness felt easier than honesty in that moment. We stood there awkwardly, surrounded by white walls and abstract paintings, people murmuring around us, and he asked how I'd been, the question heavy with things he didn't say. I told him I was good, because I was. He laughed softly and said he was glad, then added that he'd thought about me a lot over the years, that he regretted how things ended, that he hadn't handled everything the right way. I listened, nodding, noticing how his words floated between us without quite landing, like he was rehearsing an apology I'd practiced alone. Then he told me he was single now, casually, like it was an invitation disguised as information. Something inside me clicked into place. I realized he wasn't here by accident, that this wasn't just nostalgia or guilt. He was recalculating, reassessing, seeing me again now that I fit a version of what he once wanted. The irony almost made me smile. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, catch up properly, and I looked at him, really looked, at the man who once made my worth conditional, who had taught me how replaceable I was by threatening replacement. I told him no. Not harshly, not dramatically. Just no, explained gently. That my life had moved on, that I wasn't interested in reopening something that had already taught me its lesson. He seemed genuinely stunned, like rejection was a language he hadn't expected me to speak. For a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence between us, thick and exposed, and I could tell he was searching for something to say that might regain control of the moment. He asked how long I had been seeing him, the man in my life now, and I noticed how the question carried comparison inside it, like he was already measuring himself against someone he couldn't see. I answered simply, told him it had been a while, long enough to know what consistency feels like, long enough to stop bracing myself for disappointment. His expression softened in a way that almost looked like regret, but I had learned the difference between regret and inconvenience. Regret comes with accountability. Inconvenience comes when reality refuses to cooperate with expectation. He told me, unprompted, that after we divorced, he had dated a lot, that it was exciting at first. The attention, the validation, the feeling of being wanted again. Then his voice dropped slightly as he admitted how quickly it all became exhausting, how every connection felt conditional, how conversations restarted from zero over and over again. I listened without interruption, aware of how strange it felt to be the calm one now. What he didn't say mattered more than what he did. He didn't say he missed me specifically. He didn't say he had changed. He didn't say he understood the damage he had caused. He was describing loneliness, not loss. And I realized I no longer felt responsible for either. When we finally said goodbye, there was no dramatic pause, no lingering look, just a quiet acceptance on my side that this chapter had already ended long before tonight. Walking out into the cool air, I felt something close to gratitude. Some people leave to teach you how little they were ever prepared to stay. He asked if there was someone else, and I hesitated only because it felt strange to say it out loud. But then I told him yes, that I was seeing someone kind, someone who never made me feel like I was competing for my own place. His face tightened, disappointment flashing through before he masked it with something like pride. He said he was happy for me, though his voice didn't quite agree. Before we parted, he admitted, almost quietly, that things hadn't gone the way he thought they would, that dating had been harder than he expected, that connections felt shallow, temporary, transactional. I wished him well sincerely, because bitterness no longer lived in me the way it used to. As I walked away, weaving through the crowd, I felt light, not because I had lost weight or gained confidence, but because I had lost the need to be chosen by someone who never learned how to choose properly. Later that night, lying in my own bed, I thought about that woman in the grocery store parking lot, nodding under a flickering light, shrinking herself to survive a conversation. I wished I could tell her that being replaceable to the wrong person is often the first step toward becoming irreplaceable to yourself.